Somrovský, kolega z Ruhr Univerzity Bochum, z katedry Netzwerk und Datensicherheit, síťová a datová bezpečnost od profesora Švenka.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. So we decided that I will speak in English. There are two reasons for this. The first one is that Martin told me that there are some international students, so they understand. And the second reason is that I have never presented in Slovak, so I would probably not make it. But Martin, thank you very much for the introduction. I have never had such a long introduction in my life. So maybe should we make a pause now? Or small coffee break or something? Thank you. Okay, today I'm going to talk about our research and about how to analyze TLS libraries, Transport Layer Security Protocol. And the first slide is about me and my institute, and I think I can skip this slide now, because you heard a lot about us, about our institute, and so on, and it would be boring. So let's get to the topic. So today I'm going to talk about transport layer security. So transport layer security is probably the most important cryptographic protocol. So every time you visit some banking website, Amazon website, and you see this green lock on your browser, then you are using TLS. So you are using transport layer security. So every time you can see HTTPS, you are using it. And today I'm going to present some history of TLS, how important it is. Then I will present you the TLS protocol, how it works, just to give you a high-level overview. Martin has warned me that you are not that familiar with the TLS protocol maybe, and you are rather the hardware guy, so I will be very, very general. Then I will present some attacks and how can we generate a framework which will find the attacks automatically. And what attacks have we found? And then I will present our current development. So what are we doing now in this area? And what are we developing? So maybe if you want to collaborate with us or come to this Erasmus program that Martin talked about, then you can also work on these projects maybe. Okay, so let's start with the TLS history. So we have here a timeline starting with the early 90s, and in terms of computer security or TLS security, the beginning of the 90s is like the prehistoric era with some dinosaurs and so on and so on. And in this era, at the beginning of 90s, the first protocol was designed, and it was named Secure Sockets Layer version 2. And it was, 1993 or 1994, and it was deliberately broken. So afterwards, like 1 year after this standard, SL version 3 was specified. So it was 1996. In about 2000, this protocol, SSL, was renamed to Transport Layer Security. So it was adopted by IETF standardization group and was renamed from SSL to TLS. So maybe this is why you sometimes you hear SSL instead of TLS. So actually TLS 1.0 was the original SSL version 3.1. And after year 2000, in 2006, the TLS standard developed further, so new cryptographic algorithms were introduced into the protocol. New standards appeared like TLS 1.1 and 1.2, which are used now, were standardized, and currently TLS 1.3 is under development. So it should be standardized in the near future. So you would mean that probably we use nowadays TLS 1.2 because like SSL version 3 or TLS 1.0 is from the 90s when Windows 98 was used. But and nobody of you would probably use Windows 98. But this is not the case. So all these protocols are still important. So if there are studies on the web which crawl for the support of TLS on different web servers. And we can see that SL version 3, which was standardized or developed before Windows 1998, is still supported by nearly 20% of the servers. And TLS 1.0 is the most used protocol. Okay, so where do we use actually TLS? So TLS is located between the application and the transport layer. So if we want to secure some data, then we use some layer between transport and application. And this allows us to secure different protocols like FTP, SMTP, IMAP, or SOAP protocol. And this way we can apply cryptographic mechanisms like encryption or signatures to these protocols. Of course, there are also many libraries. So these libraries are there for different purposes. They are they are written in different languages. They are used for embedded devices. They are dedicated for servers, for clients, and so on and so on. And maybe you have heard of some of them. So, for example, OpenSSL is well used. I've seen that you have some lectures where you use OpenSSL. Then, but there are many, many more. So, for example, GNU TLS, JSSE, Microsoft S Channel, and so on and so on. And you can imagine that developing a library is hard. Developing a cryptographic library is very hard, and we have to somehow test them and search for some bugs. Okay, so how do we do it? And first, let me introduce the TLS protocol just on a high level. How does it work? Good. So TLS protocol is mainly divided into two phases. The first phase is the TLS handshake. In the TLS handshake, we agree on the algorithms, versions, and extensions that we are going to use. So, for example, we agree on the TLS version. Are we using TLS 1.0, 1.2, and so on? And are we using, for example, RSA, key exchange, or elliptic curves, and so on? And once the TLS handshake is provided, is established, then we have encrypted and authenticated data channel, so we can send our data over this channel encrypted. So how does it work in more details? So imagine we have a client and a server. And the client wants to speak to this server. So he first sends a client hello message. In this client hello message, what does the client do? He sends, for example, I'm using this specific TLS version. I'm using these ciphers. I'm using RSA, for example. And I'm using some extensions. The server receives this message and responds with some server hello message, with certificate message and server hello done. So server hello sends something like, hey, I am there. And I can really use this version, or I can use this cipher suite. Then it sends the certificate, which contains the public key of the server, and some server hello down message. The client then retrieves the public key of the server. So he can now encrypt some secret to the server, and it is located in the client, it is sent in a client key exchange message. So the client sends a client key exchange message, which has some secret encrypted with the public key of the server. Then chain cipherspec message, which says, OK, now we can speak in an encrypted way. And at the end, the client sends a client finish message, which confirms or authenticates the wall handshake. The server does the same, and afterwards, they can exchange application data, which are encrypted and authenticated, so they are secure. Good. This was very basic TLS handshake. So this was one of the many TLS handshakes, one of the many versions that we can establish. So there are different versions. For example, we can use different cryptographic primitives which can change the number of messages that are exchanged or add some new messages. For example, we can use RSA, elliptic curves. We can use different cryptographic primitives for symmetric ciphers like AES, triple des, RC4, CHA-CHA, and so on, or some post-quantum cryptographic mechanisms like New Hope are nowadays also there. It can be executed over TCP or UDP, and there are many extensions and protocol flows. So for example, now considering this basic TLS handshake, we can, speaking like elliptic curves, we have to, with elliptic curves, we can send something like server key exchange by the server. If the client authenticates, he can also send a certificate and certificate verify message. And if the client wants to send more extensions, it can send several extensions like Heartbeat or SNI extensions. So there are many, many more. And instead of application data, we can also send some Heartbeat messages, which are specific messages. I'm going to talk about them a bit later. Okay, so this gives you an overview how complex TLS can become and how can it be to implement a TLS library. Good. So let's talk about attacks. So this complexity of TLS, of this TLS protocol, resulted in many attacks. And this is the TLS history that I presented you a few minutes ago. And I already said that TLS is one of the most important protocols in cryptographic protocols that we use. So it became also a target of many scientific researchers, and so it already started in 1996 as Wagner and Schneier presented the first analysis of the SL version 3 protocol, and they basically said SL version 2, the previous protocol, is completely broken. Then, for example, in 1998, there was an attack called Bleichenbacher's attack, also million message attack. Have you heard about it, maybe? Million message attack? Yeah. Okay. So, this attack was targeting RSA key exchange and specific PKCS1 formatting in RSA. And it allowed to decrypt the TLS connection. Then, with the time, different attacks came in, and with the time, starting with 2010 or 2011, TLS became so popular that the attacks became got names. So, for example, have you maybe heard about attacks like Beast, Crime, Breach, or Lucky 13? Maybe some of them. So. And at the end of 2014-15, the attacks received also logos. So, yes. So I'm not going to talk about all the attacks. I'm just going to show you some of them and show why TLS is so complex and what can go wrong there. So I'm going to concentrate on 3 attacks and show you what was the problem there. Okay, so let's start with the early CCS attack. Early CCS or early chain cipherspec attack is an attack, as a man-in-the-middle attack, which was targeting a specific OpenSSL version, TLS library version. And it could be done as follows. So we have a man-in-the-middle attacker who is sitting between the client and the server. And what he does, he just removes the client key exchange message. What have I said? So what does the client key exchange message have? It has some cryptographic keys, master key, which is transmitted to the server. So since the client key exchange message is missing, the server computed specific OpenSSL versions, computed the master key based on 0 value. So we can force the server compute with some 0 key. And in specific scenarios, we can execute man-in-the-middle attacks. This attack was, in general, targeting some state machines in TLS. So we can see that implementing a TLS state machine, like what messages are sent in which directions and after each error, This is decided by a state machine. This is implemented by a state machine. And after this attack, as it came out, there are more researchers that, who found out that there are more attacks like this. For example, like freak attack, which targeted similar behavior of TLS implementations. Or there were some researchers from Netherlands who also developed attacks which somehow sent messages in different order, and they could exploit some behavior of the libraries. Okay. I'm sorry, please shut down your phones if you're speaking. Okay, the next one is Heartbleed. But this one, have you heard of Heartbleed? Anybody? Okay, good. So just how it works and just a brief overview. So this Heartbleed attack is targeting the heartbeat protocol in the TLS. The heartbeat protocol can be spoken after the TLS handshake was established. So how does it work? So we have a client who sends a heartbeat message which has some bytes, for example, hey. And it says this message has 3 bytes. The server answers with exactly the same message with heartbeat, with hey, I'm there, and exactly with these 3 bytes. Do you know why is this protocol needed? Do you have an idea why is it the case? Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. So I already told you that TLS can be used also or UDP. So UDP is stateless, so we do not know whether the other end is still there. So we can send some heartbeat messages and find out he's there or not. And so how was it exploited? So we have here again our attacker, and he wants to exploit a specific behavior of the openness library. And he sends also a hey message, but he sets now the length to 1000. What the server does, it attempts to construct this heartbeat message and attempts to read 1000 message out of the buffer. But this buffer is only 3 bytes long. So it reads over the buffer, it's a so-called buffer overread, and reads some data, random data out of the memory and sends it back to the client. So this is a so-called buffer overread, was exploited in the Heartbleed attack, and at the time as Heartbleed came out, there was a big question, so what do this random data contain? So OpenSSL was the vulnerable server, so the most important cryptographic library, and what do these data include? Do they include some valid data, some cryptographic keys? And after Heartbleed came out, Cloudflare, which is some cloud infrastructure company, announced a challenge. So they set up a vulnerable server and said, okay, everybody who can extract a private key can receive some money or something like this. And in like a few hours, there were about 14 winners who could really extract private cryptographic keys out of the data. So there's a blog post about it, and there's also a CCC talk about how the challenge was solved. So the guys the researchers sent about 1 million server requests, then collected some data, did some analysis, and really could extract private keys from the server. So Heartbleed had a huge impact because OpenSSL is the most important cryptographic library, and according to some studies, 500,000 servers were impacted by this bug. What was also interesting was that after Heartbleed came out and after it was clear that there are cryptographic keys leaking, like RSA private keys, everybody was like, you have to update your certificate, you have to update that certificate, you have to update your keys. And 7% of these websites updated their certificates, but they left the same RSA private key inside, so yeah. Okay. It was quite interesting. Okay, and the last one that I want to motivate is adaptive chosen ciphertext attacks. So adaptive chosen ciphertext attacks, I'm not going into details, just give a high-level overview. Adaptive chosen ciphertext attacks are attacks where the attacker intercepts some TLS connection or some connection, some ciphertexts, and modifies the ciphertext somehow, sends it to the server, and uses the server as an oracle. Yeah, and so what the server does actually is decrypts the ciphertext, validates it somehow, and responds to the server, to the attacker, whether it is valid or not. And the attacker performs this several times, and at the end, he can decrypt the key or the ciphertext. Okay, and I'm not going into details. There are cryptographic attacks, but two basic attacks that can be provided is Woden's attack on ASCBC and Bleichenbacher's attack on PKCS 1.5. Good. So by changing some ciphertexts, by some crypto magic, you can extract the keys or decrypt the ciphertext. Okay. So the question is, so TLS libraries can be broken, and the question is, how can we test these attacks, or can we find such attacks like Heartbleed or ALCCS automatically with some new library? And so what we did, we analyzed some framework prerequisites, so what can we do? And then we designed our own framework which can do this. So as recent attacks on TLS showed, that these are not only crypto attacks. So these are attacks that are targeting TLS state machines, like early CCS that I presented. And there are buffer overflows or overreads, because these libraries, TLS libraries like OpenSSL, are written in unsafe languages like C or C++. And so, for example, there was a nice case that it is hard to get it right. So, for example, in 2016, it was in September, I mean, there was a high-level vulnerability in OpenSSL, which was patched. But a few days afterwards, after the patch, it was found out that this high-level vulnerability was actually the patch was introducing a critical vulnerability. So they needed to patch after a few days. So it is really hard to test, to patch, and to get it correctly. So there are also cryptographic attacks, there are man-in-the-middle attacks, and so on and so on. Okay, so what prerequisites do we have? So we want to execute a flexible protocol flow, which allows you to delete TLS messages, add some TLS messages. So, for example, you want to duplicate client key exchange message. You want to modify messages before they are encrypted. So, for example, if you are if you have this application message, then it is already encrypted, but you want to modify the data which is going to be sent before it is encrypted. You want to detect invalid behavior, and you want to reproduce the protocol flow. So this is why we designed TLS-Attacker. So TLS-Attacker is a flexible TLS framework for fuzzing, testing, writing attacks. It is open source. It is written in Java. And it's already found some vulnerabilities. It was used to find some vulnerabilities in OpenSSL, Botan, or matrices, and so on. We say that, so the first version that was presented like last year, it is like a Swiss knife for TLS, we can say. So it had some basic TLS protocol flows, extensions, TLS 1.0, 1.2, and mainly it was TLS client-based. What we are doing now, we are developing it further. So we want to achieve something which is bigger, which works more reliably. So the current status, what we deployed, is supporting more TLS versions, is supporting more attacks, it supports some more extensions, man-in-the-middle framework, and so on and so on. So how does TLS-Attacker work in general? Just to give you a motivation or high-level overview, how does the framework work? So TLS-Attacker can be started by defining some protocol flows using some actions. So we have some basic actions like send, receive, or wait. And we can use these actions to send arbitrary messages. So we can say something like send client hello, and then receive some server hello certificate and server hello done. So we can define this in our protocol flow. We can do this in Java, as I said, this is a Java framework, but we can do this also in XML. So we can be very flexible, and we can say something like the same protocol flow that I showed here. I can now say I will send these messages with client hello, and afterwards I will receive some server hello certificate and server hello done. As an attacker, you can imagine that we can do many things with it. So for example, what we can do, we can introduce a waiting action, which just adds some timer. So after we receive these 3 messages, we want to wait some 10 seconds, 10,000 milliseconds. Or what we can do, we can send more messages. So we can again, after receiving this server hello certificate, server hello done, we can send RSA a key exchange message, or we can send it twice, we can delete it, and so on and so on. So this framework allows us to be very flexible, send arbitrary messages in an arbitrary order. Good. So we can now run arbitrary protocol flows. So how can we modify variables? And for this purpose, we use something like a concept called modifiable variables. So the best way to explain this concept is to just give you an example. So imagine we have a modifiable integer, which is set to the value 30. And we set a modification, add modification with 20. And if we now introduce a getter value, so we invoke a getter on this modifiable integer, we receive 30 plus 20. Okay, this is very simple, sounds stupid, but it is very nice or useful if we use these modifiable variables in the protocol flows. So for example, if we want to define a heartbleed, so heartbleed was an implementation bug. So in case we wanted to test it as a developer, we needed to patch OpenSSL and attempt with our own library and so on. With TLS-Attacker, it is just to define a protocol, a workflow trace. At the end, it sends some heartbeat message. And instead of heartbeat message, we can define something like, okay, this payload length is modified in a way that the payload is increased by value 20,000. So with a few lines of code, we can write a heartbleed attack. Okay, so last year we wrote already some, we performed some fuzzing, some attacks, and so on, and we found some padding oracles in OpenSSL, both on matrix SSL. We found Bleichenbacher attacks. We found some problems in GNU TLS or OpenSSL, and we found some buffer overflows or overreads in OpenSSL or Botan libraries. So this was in 2016, and we are continuing this research. So I'm not going into these attacks and why they worked, but what is interesting is, for example, in case of matrix SSL, the developers attempted to fix a lucky 13 attack, which is a timing attack, really, really hard to exploit, and they introduced a direct padding oracle attack, which is very easy to exploit. So, and we were able to find it with TLS-Attacker. Okay, I prepared some demo, so hopefully I can. So, in case of you want to play with TLS-Attacker, Everything is available on GitHub. So there is a manual how to compile it, how you can. I'm not sure if you are familiar with Java and Maven, so you can use Java and Maven to compile it. There is an explanation how the code structure works, how the framework works, what features are supported, and so on and so on, and what you can do with it. So, for example, there is a simple workflow trace that you can execute, and what we also have is a wiki which is defining some attacks. So there are some executables that allow you to execute the Bleichenbacher attack or Heartbleed and so on. What you can do is you can execute a TLS client or TLS server. So what you can do, you can connect to Google or to any service and to execute arbitrary protocol flows. But please do not do is play with on localhost. Okay, good. What is interesting also, good, if you don't want to compile, we have also releases. So yes, just yesterday we released a new version, so you can download it, you can extract it. There are Java executables that you can use. And for example, what I have here, so now I have a server running on my local host. So what I can do with TLS-Attacker, I can just write something like java jar TLS client, jar, and then connect and say connect to the local host, and the TLS attacker executes a TLS workflow. So if you now consider Wireshark, you can see the messages that we send, like client hello, server hello, client key exchange, chain cipherspec. The basic TLS handshake has been established. And you can go further, and you can, for example, play with these XML traces. So what I have now here is the basic XML trace defining a client hello, then server hello certificate, oops, and server hello done, and afterwards I send just RSA client key exchange. So what I can do is just execute this one, and I say at the end that I want to say as a workflow input this file. So I can execute it, and I will send the same messages. So I will send at the end RSA client key change second finish message. And what I can, for example, do now, I can add a time, waiting time there. So I say I want to wait before receiving this message and before sending these messages. I can now wait 5 seconds. So what TLS-Attacker does is executes waiting for 5,000 milliseconds, and this can be done, of course, with just this simple message flow. What I can do, of course, is just duplicate RSA client key exchange message. If I do this and execute it again, then after this waiting period, I send, instead of one client key exchange message, I send 2 client key exchange messages. Yeah, and that's it. And we can observe this also using Wireshark. Okay, good. I would like to spend a few minutes on the current development. So what is interesting on what we are doing now on TLS-Attacker. So we are performing further fuzzing and differential fuzzing. Are you doing some fuzzing here on this university, or do you know AFL, PIN, and so on? Okay. So what we want to achieve is that, for example, if we have OpenSSL library, and if we send different messages to the OpenSSL servers, we want to hit as many source code lines as possible. And this can be done with a so-called instrumentation. So with AFL or PIN, we can do something like observe how many source code lines have we hit with our TLS-Attacker framework. And this is done, this is called instrumentation. What we're also performing is differential fuzzing. So imagine we have a client and we have different servers, so how differential fuzzing works. We have servers in 3 versions, OpenSSL 1.0.2a, 2b, and 2c. And we send the same workflow trace to the server, to these servers, and observe that one of these servers, the second one, responded with a different message. Okay, so then we can indicate that there is probably something wrong going on, and then we can analyze it further. So this is called differential fuzzing, and this is what we are currently doing. Currently we have some overflows in matrix SSL, crashes in WolfSSL library. Hopefully we have more coming soon. We are also testing not only servers, but also clients. What we want to do is also fingerprinting on what we are now developing. So motivation for this is, for example, imagine that you connect to some Amazon or PayPal.com server. And you found there a bug or something, and you want to find out which library are they using. Or, for example, what library is used in F5 Cisco firewalls, and so on and so on. So we want to use fuzzing to learn this implementation and to fingerprint them, so how, what library is used there. So first, we use some learning phase, where we observe the behavior of different TLS servers. And afterwards, we fingerprint them, and afterwards, if we go to a different server, then we can find out, okay, this was probably OpenSSL 1.0 because it behaves exactly like this one. So the ultimate goal is the library identification with as few requests as possible, and we want to establish this using machine learning techniques. So machine learning, this is some kind of, so why do we use it? Everybody says that this is something what solves any problem, and the second reason is that you can sell it in a paper now. And so, okay. We have a minor problem. We are not that good experts on it, but we have a plan. We have a colleague who sent us this nice graphic, which there are many machine learning techniques, and we do not know which one to use. So we can now, with this technique, with this graph, we can find out which was the best one for us. Or if you are working in this area, maybe you can also, if you visit Bochum, then you can work with us and you can help us. Okay. Then we are also developing a test suite. So most TLS test suites that are implemented in OpenSSL or in these libraries do not handle corner cases or attacks. And we want to develop a test suite that can be used for libraries. So for example, you use OpenSSL server, you run it, and you send many, many workflow traces there, and you say, okay, all these are passed, or this passed, and the library is behaving correctly. So we are using it, developing it currently. Our student is developing it, it's his master thesis. Okay, and the last one, what we are working on now is IPv4 or scan. So we want to integrate TLS-Attacker into IPv4 scanner, and to find some vulnerabilities, some new attacks, and so on. So what I learned from my friend Hanno book, he says always that if there is any potential vulnerability that you can think of, then you will always find a vulnerable server which is vulnerable to this attack. And very recently, like in 2 months ago, I think we found F5 appliances are vulnerable to Bleichenbacher attacks. Yeah, we established this, we found this by IPv4 scanning. So we scanned with specific implementations, with modified TLS protocol flows for some Bleichenbacher side channels, and we could really find many servers vulnerable to Bleichenbacher's attack, even if this attack is nearly 20 years old. So, okay. So this is what we are currently working on. So to conclude, maintaining a crypto library or TLS library is hard. So this does not only apply to TLS. This also applies to different libraries. Maybe you are working on SSH, IPsec, or different libraries. And we have seen that there are many cryptographic attacks, many overflow, overread attacks, and we have seen that new code and patches can introduce new attacks. So for this purpose, we developed TLS-Attacker, and we are working on it to validate TLS implementations, and so on and so on. Okay, thank you very much. Okay. You can also ask in Czech.
May I ask you, do you have some cooperation of various TLS implementations, and can you compare especially OpenSSL and libSSL and BrutLSL, if libSSL is really better in security than OpenSSL or not?
So in terms of cooperations, we do not have direct cooperations. I know that Matrix SSL and Botan are using TLS-Attacker for tests. So they are really using it. In terms of OpenSSL and libSSL, I do not know whether I want to tell it on camera, but yeah, okay. Yeah, so as Heartbeat bug appeared, maybe you do not know the history, then everybody was like, we hate OpenSSL. There are so many bad developers and so on, and so many bugs. Let's create something new, or let's use a different library. So there was a fork of OpenSSL, and it was called libSSL. But the libSSL library is based on the same code as OpenSSL, but I have a feeling that they do not have that much manpower as OpenSSL now does. And they are not that responsive as OpenSSL developers in terms of if we reported them something, their reaction was not that fast. And we can see on the OpenSSL library that it is developing now very fast because it is also supported by Google. So there are many Google developers working directly on OpenSSL, and they are fixing it. So if I would choose something now, then I would go for OpenSSL.
Well, libSSL developers forked OpenSSL, and the goal is to remove as much code from OpenSSL as they can. So they removed SSL 3 and some not very useful extensions. So they're trying to simplify the code base and clean it. Instead of OpenSSL, it's trying to just add more and more bloat and to make it more secure with the bloat. It's nonsense. But I'm one of core developers of Alpine Linux, and we switched to libSSL 1 year ago. It seemed to be more secure than OpenSSL, but as you said, libSSL developers don't have so much manpower, and we're currently not very happy with the current race because I personally discovered some vulnerabilities. They introduced it in patch version just by accident when I ran Nginx test. I was really surprised that I found such critical bug. Generally speaking, they just switch it some value, so engines accepted invalid certificate. So TLS was basically useless in this state.
Yeah, so I had the same feeling. So last year I reported some bug to LibreSSL and OpenSSL. OpenSSL, it was like 1 day or a few hours response time. LibreSSL, it was like 1 month response time. It was like, oh, OpenSSL fixed this. Probably you are this reporter. Okay, thank you. It seems to be fixed. Okay, so yeah. So I have the same.
Okay, my final question. The vulnerabilities, if show it us here, basically all of them was caused by shitty implementation, not by design of protocol.
Yes.
How many vulnerabilities in history was caused by design of TLS protocol in comparison with shitty implementation like in OpenSSL? Are there any well-known vulnerabilities caused by design flaw?
Caused by what?
By flaw in design of protocol and state machines, not implementation.
Yeah, so to find a protocol vulnerability, it's quite hard currently. So there, so most of them, so as you said, most of the vulnerabilities that I presented were just library vulnerabilities that were introduced by wrong state machines and so on. And this is because the state machines were not designed properly. In case of TLS protocol is designed properly in most of the cases. But the problem is mainly the implementation of these state machines in the protocol. In case of these TLS protocol vulnerabilities, there were some in the recent years, but they were found mainly by a careful analysis of TLS. I cannot really imagine that this could be done by a systematic analysis with this tool. Such findings, this could you would be very lucky or something like that if you would find something in TLS protocol by just fuzzing. Could be, but I think the TLS protocol is so well researched in theory that I cannot imagine that you could find it in fuzzing. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So, for example, I was also a co-author of the drone attack. The drone attack was something like you misused or exploited a vulnerability in SL version 2 to break TLS. So SL version 2, this is the oldest protocol that I showed here, and it was possible to break TLS, to decrypt TLS traffic by exploiting a vulnerability in SL version 2. But this was only done by really careful analysis of us and not by systematic testing with TLS-Attacker. So, and most of the attacks that I know that are like, then they are also done by systematic analysis.
How does attack work? It forces server to switch from TLS1 to so when you have library that don't support all the versions, then this vulnerability can be exploited.
It was a vulnerability in the protocol in combination with SSL version 2. In TLS protocol in combination with SSL version 2, the problem was that many servers had this turned on per default. And there were some bugs in OpenSSL that made this attack even stronger. And yeah.